Nicholas is the CEO and founder of Lateral Economics, as well as the chair of the Open Knowledge Foundation Australia. He is a visiting professor at King's College London's Policy Institute and is a widely published policy economist, entrepreneur, and commentator. Nicholas has advised cabinet ministers, has sat on Australia's Productivity Commission, and founded the mortgage brokerage Peach Financial. We are very fortunate to have Nicholas come in today to talk to us about evidence-based policy making, policy evaluation, and his proposed Evaluator General. Nicholas, welcome.
Hi there. Yeah, sorry. Hi.
Yeah, no, I love it. Yeah. All right. So just to start off, would you mind telling us briefly about your background and how it shaped your thinking about policy making?
Well, I guess the two things that are worth mentioning is that I learnt economics before I studied economics. So my father was an economist, and I discovered, somewhat to my dismay, when I started working as a 20-something-year-old staffer for the industry minister, that at least in some ways I had a better functioning intuition about economics than lots of economists who had learnt their craft at universities and had mistaken the content of the learning for its application. So they knew about supply and demand graphs and all this sort of stuff, but policy is always about concrete problems. And the way in which you get them out of a textbook, you should always not exactly be suspicious of it, but that's the starting point. And then you have to apply human ingenuity to ask, is this the right way to think about it? What are the other ways of thinking about it? And the way is in which, I got involved in reforming the car industry. And it wasn't, I wasn't making up any incredibly new concepts. What I was doing was trying to listen to the concepts that were being used and ask questions about how they were being applied. To give you an example, we were cutting tariffs for cars because it was said that it was a good idea to have all parts of the Australian economy assisted, which is what tariffs do, by about the same amount. That's the level playing field idea. And one of the things I managed to unpack in that process was that we were assisting import replacement. So tariffs raise domestic prices and make it more worthwhile for the local industry to produce for the domestic market. And tariffs do nothing for exports. So what I was able to do is to take this simple idea of a level playing field and say, well, we really should be thinking separately about two different playing fields, because we have an unlevel playing field between the car industry, which is highly assisted, and the rest of the economy, and we want to even that up. And we also have an unlevel playing field within the car industry, because if you want to produce for export, you get no help. And if you want to produce for the import replacement, you get a huge amount of help. So that was a simple piece of common sense. It didn't come from me learning anything much, except that I had a feel for economics and I kind of understood these arguments. But it's a good illustration of how something that was taken to be commonsensical and was commonsensical could be unpacked so that you understood the situation better than had previously been understood, just by paying attention to the way in which you were using the ideas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, which we might be able to talk about quite a bit more as we go, is that I've had a range of experiences. That was those two are the most important, or were very important, which is sort of coming across economics and realizing that I was quite excited by how simple and powerful it was. And then this application of economics in policy making, and then a range of other experiences. And I rather like, if students want to go and look it up if they haven't seen it before, Stephen Jobs gives a commencement address in which he talks about things that happened to his life, which he connected up in retrospect. And, you know, we only lead one life and lots of things happen. And when you can tie different bits of your experience together, then you're starting to make more of your experience. And so I've had a long experience in public policy. That was my first experience that I talked about. But then as a member of the Productivity Commission, on the staff of other politicians like the Treasurer, and then as a consultant, and then also as chairman of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. So it's those sorts of experiences that have altogether been kind of packaged up into this idea of the Evaluator General, which will be an important thing that we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So before we do get to the Evaluator General, in this course, we've talked a lot about evidence-based policy making, and to potentially set myself up to get knocked down here, do you have any, do you want to sort of talk to us a bit about what evidence-based policy making is, why governments seem so keen on it, and how well it's sort of put into practice?
It's a nice thing to say, and I recall Malcolm Turnbull saying, and I think he sort of believed it, he wasn't just being cynical, but when he arrived at the Prime Ministership, and he was making a bit of a, trying to make a bit of a contrast with Tony Abbott, who not many people would accuse of evidence-based policy making. Malcolm Turnbull said, well, his government would be an evidence-based policy making government. And I guess he was intimating things about climate change and things like that, accepting the science. And he was saying that in a much more thoroughgoing way than just science. But almost immediately afterwards, one of the things that the Turnbull government did was to expand what do you call it? Income, is it called income maintenance? No, it's not. Anyway, it's the provision of income to groups, welfare to groups, which is tied to spending, income, you know, cards. So what's
Yes,
the term? Income management, I think it's called. I think it's, anyway,
yeah.
Let's call it income management for the sake of it. Now,
I think it is income management.
The evidence on that is that it causes a lot of distress. It's relatively socially dysfunctional. There are circumstances usually where people choose it, where it can be very helpful. But anyway, so right after telling us how evidence-based he would be, he was caught up in the theatre of politics and the theatre of government. And, you know, everyone has an idea in their head that why would you want to pay people who then go out and take drugs or sniff petrol? And it's a good question. It's just that it doesn't lead you directly to a good answer. So even somebody who I think in a bona fide way thought of himself as being evidence-based wasn't particularly evidence-based. Now, more generally, I'm here to give you some shocking news, and other people will think I'm exaggerating. Other people will think I'm, you know, a bit of a firebrand and someone who's just a little bit just isn't being nice enough about the system that we have. But I think that the system is full of senior managers in the bureaucracy who talk about evidence-based policy, and they don't, here's another pretty bold claim, they don't actually know much about what it is. They think of evidence-based policy as having lots of reports from Deloitte and a university, lots of randomized controlled trials. And I would say they are, well, they're the tip of an iceberg. They're certain symptoms of an evidence-based approach, but they're utterly incapable of delivering a really evidence-based approach to something. And if you look at well-managed companies, they don't do evaluations. They're constantly doing little experiments. They're measuring things. They know about their own ignorance, and they're always trying to reduce their own ignorance and so on. That's an evidence-based approach. And it's very different to what is done in government. And it's very different to the sorts of sociological and institutional drivers which lead senior politicians and senior bureaucrats to talk about the importance of evidence-based policy as if they know what it is and as if it's a fairly straightforward thing to create. And I think that that's absolutely not true, and we're not very close to evidence-based policy at all.
So this is good, candid stuff that we're getting today.
We have pockets of very good practice, and the dramatic fact is that although we tell ourselves a story in which we will build from good practice and we'll scale it, we've been saying that for 30 years, and there's no single thing that we've scaled other than there's no single thing that I know of, and perhaps someone can help me by contradicting me, but there's no single program that I know of that started small and was so good that we scaled it. There are programs like the NDIS, which the government announced it would build a massive new program. And, you know, they have lots of hiccups and lots of things wrong with them, but that's how we have scaled things. We have not scaled things in this evidence-based way that we talk about scaling things, which is to notice experiments that are working out and to expand them and to close down the ones that don't work. We have lots of pilots, but they just run in the background and they don't actually affect what ends up being built.
And so that actually leads us quite nicely then into the sort of next part of the talk and kind of the bulk of the talk, really. So you've proposed a new government institution, which you call the Evaluator General. As I've come to understand it, I've realized it's really several ideas rather than one, really. The wrong way to think about it is to think of somebody gets put in at the top and starts trying to evaluate everything that's going on throughout the hierarchical system. You've explained it to me partly by way of explaining your own history and what problems you developed it to solve. So over the next 30 minutes, I'd like to take our students through that story, if that's all right, to help them understand what it's about. So in the process, I think we should be trying to think of what parts of an effective system are currently missing. And perhaps we had a bit of an email exchange in the run-up to this that we could talk a bit about the contents of. To go through it,
Sure, all right. Well, let's start then with my shocked enthusiasm for the Toyota production system. So this is 1983, and I start doing, you know, economists always used to say, I mean, we'd go on plant tours, different car factories and so on. And I always used to go on those tours, and I used to find them fascinating. And I used to ask lots of questions. And when I ask questions, I'm looking for answers that surprise me, because if they surprise me, obviously there's some archaeology I've got to do about my own assumptions and so on. And anyway, one of the things that was going on, and it was very big in the industry, everybody was noticing this, which was that Toyota particularly, and the Japanese, had this way of manufacturing cars, which was either they were dumping them and they were being subsidized into the Australian market. The problem with that is that the same thing was going on in Europe and in America. These cars were just coming in at incredibly low prices. I mean, here's a nice fact for you. In 1974, my exposure to this really started in 1983, but in 1974, the two cars on the Australian market with the highest build quality, the lowest defects, the lowest repairs under warranty, were the Mercedes-Benz 350 SLE, with which the Prime Minister drove around in, which created its own storm because he wasn't in an Australian car, and the Toyota Corolla. And Mercedes got the car in the incredible state that it was by having more inspectors on the line than any other car manufacturer, and they sold these things for 5 or 6 times as much as other cars, and so it was easy to do that for them. It was profitable to do that for them. Toyota did it by not having any inspectors at all. Toyota did it with with a philosophy that turned everything upside down and tried to look at the and at least if you, I don't know if this is how they got to the idea, but if you look back at it in retrospect, you can say that they're saying building a car involves coordinating 90,000 manufacturing operations within suppliers, within our factories, and so on, connecting up knowledge about what consumers want, what they don't want, and then optimizing that. And their system was based on the idea that manager's job was not to be the super brain behind all this, but to facilitate the people with the knowledge, and the people with the knowledge were the workers on the line, who were arranged into teams, and whose goodwill and whose good intentions were presumed. So manager's job was not to identify people who were shirking and stop that going on. That would happen naturally within teams. The factories were full of signs that said things, sort of big, simple, slightly dumb things, like people come to work every day to do a good day's work, not a bad day's work. So this was a socio-technical system. They gave their workers job security, which the American system didn't have, and they gave them literally 10 times as much training. So they gave them statistical control training so that they could handle their CNC equipment there, which was a sort of forerunner of digital computers on the line, the machine tools. So they could take readouts from the machine tools, test, say, the smoothness of their operating so that they could identify that just before lunch they were working less productively than just after lunch, and then they could investigate that and so on. And through the mechanism of 1,000 small things, this productivity juggernaut simply took off. And I might show you a picture. And to do that, I'm going to have to, yeah. So I'll share the screen with you, and I'll show you a picture of that. Can you see that? There we are.
Yep.
This is and students can have a look at this in the materials, but this is an extraordinary graph in which you can see that US automotive labor productivity just bumps along on the origin, at zero growth, productivity growth for a decade. And the Japanese production is just steadily going up. And if you look at the axes, at the end of that 20-year, roughly 20-year process, you have Japanese productivity at 700, whereas against its productivity of 100 the 20 years before, compared with the American system, which starts at 100 by definition. It's an index, and it only goes up to about 250. And that is just the, no, I've mucked it up now. I'm just going back to looking at you again, if I can. I don't know how to resume.
Up the top, it'll say...
yeah, new share, you are screen sharing. Stop share, there we are. And then, well, I shouldn't have done that so quickly, because the other part of the graph, but you can look at this in materials, is that, and it's a significant part of the story, the American assemblers, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, and so on, they figure out quite a lot of about half of what Toyota's doing in the factories. And but the productivity of their suppliers doesn't grow at all. And so they're operating as predators, basically. And whenever a supplier gets some productivity improvement, the manufacturers just steal it from them because they're in a monopsony relationship. The buyers are effectively, they have to pay them enough to keep them in business, but they take all the surplus, basically. And so there's no incentive for the suppliers to get better at what they're doing. So this was a dramatic illustration of something. And what thrilled me about it was this way in which it wasn't just a new technology trick, it was a technology platform, a technology trick, which was based on thinking better about human beings, about playing to their strengths, not their weaknesses, building on their strengths. I thought this was thrilling. Well, as your students can verify by looking at the economic literature, this passed economists by more or less absolutely as a rightward shift of the supply curve. That was it. To me, what it was showing was something which, again, in retrospect, I realize has always been a big thing for me, which is, it turns out I learned a couple of years ago when I was interested in democracy, is the ancient Athenians had a word for this in their politics, and we don't really have a word for it. So they had the concept of freedom of speech, but it was a very different concept to ours. And they had another concept which they called isegoria, which really means equality of speech. So here's an idea that has motivated me, which is that in a hierarchy, there is a kind of a gravitational force of near black hole power, which is that the perspectives and the interests of the people at the top, the people who make the rules, the people who choose who gets promoted, and so on and so forth, their perspectives come to dominate. And it turns out that, and this is why democracies tend to do better than autocracies, it turns out that privileging the perspectives and the interests of the people at the top in complex systems is a massive drain on productivity. It stops them learning, and what it does instead is it sends them through endless theatrical loops where they're demonstrating how clever they are, how responsive they are, how responsible they are. They're protecting this. Everyone's protecting the person above them, kicking down sometimes. And the learning, which is all there, of people in the field just goes by the board. So I've always kind of had that in the back of my mind. And then when I come to government, I'm very aware of that. I'm very aware that government is dominated by bureaucracies. And yet, Toyota gives us an example of a bureaucracy that got it, if you like, that understood that it had, I mean, humility is a big deal in Toyota. Toyota executives happen to take a much lesser multiple of average worker earnings than Western executives do, which is another interesting fact. So Toyota happened upon this system, which, as I say, is a socio-cultural system, technical system. It's part technique, but it's also about culture. And it's about playing to people's better natures, understanding that that's a massive resource, and that there isn't, and when you're doing something really complex, it's maybe the only resource you have, because the people at the top are so reliant on the people further down for their source of information that if you can't build on their goodwill, you're actually just going to end up with this big organization that is a bit like the Yes Minister in Utopia, where there's lots of justification going on, but not a lot of learning and stuff that's under the radar. Who knows what goes on? So that's anyway. There are a number of that's the first element of this thing that ends up as the Evaluator General.
So just to quickly double back for a second, you talked about accountability theatre and sort of gave a bit of an example of it. Can you sort of give us the example of how accountability theatre plays out in government or in politics?
Sure,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I've got there's an article in the reading list that I really recommend. He said modestly, called Accountability from Above and Below. And I was reading a paper by the Institute for Government in London, which I think is a good organisation. And I was sort of slowly appalled. It was about accountability, and the whole paper seemed to imply that accountability was about senior people imposing accountability on more junior people. And in fact, they asked for comments. So I sent them a long comment, and it was out of that experience that I wrote this piece. So consider Job Active. Job Active, which is the outsourced service. It used to be called the Commonwealth Employment Service in the 1980s. It was run by government. They then turned it into a contracted out service, and different agencies around the country, for profit and not for profit, will get a contract to provide services to help unemployed people get jobs around the country, and there would be scores of companies that do this. Now, I'm not privy to what is in their monitoring and evaluation, but one would imagine that what is in it is there'll be, number of, what you see quoted by these systems is how many people Job Active has helped into jobs. Mm-hmm. Now, note the ambiguity of that term, helped into jobs. Mm-hmm. They don't tell you how many people wouldn't have got jobs but for Job Active. Mm-hmm. That's what matters. But nothing in the accountability theatre requires anyone to know that, and it's a damn hard thing to know. Knowing what the counterfactual is hard. That's sort of what science is based on. Comparing, you have a hypothesis and you say, if it was true, this would happen, and you go looking for the truth or falsity of that. So that's an example of how accountability theatre dominates good practice, and the people in it don't even know. And this is going on as we speak in New Zealand, because in New Zealand, the new Prime Minister, not that new anymore, but the superstar Prime Minister they have over there, Jacinda Ardern, wants to target well-being. Well, isn't that a good thing? It's a fantastically good thing. Not only that, but the Treasury in New Zealand had, for years before she arrived on the scene, been working on a well-being framework, which I'd been in some contact with them about. And that well-being framework will tell you, for instance, this is this is just an example. I don't know whether it's literally true, but it will be able to tell you on a scale from 1 to 10, if the average degree of Indigenous subjectively assessed well-being in Rotorua, say, and it'll be able to say that on average, Maori in Rotorua rate themselves at 7.2 out of 10, compared with a national average of 7.8 out of 10, or whatever it is. But here's the shocking thing. You can know, you can invest a huge amount of money and time and effort into this thing. You can build a dashboard. You can be very proud of yourself. The politicians will show it to people, but that dashboard doesn't, if you're driving along, you need something that enables you to turn left or right. And all that data you've got is not data about how to improve Maori well-being. And if it was, it would be very different data. Of course, it's nice to know the data about what the level is, but getting data on what it would be like if we did this different or that different, or how much higher it is than it would have been if we hadn't stopped this thing happening nearby where we were screwing up teacher training or something or other. So that's an example of where accountability theatre takes people away from asking very simple questions. Nothing I've said is rocket science. And you can go to university and you can do data science, you can do all kinds of things. You can certainly do statistics, and you're not introduced to this idea that what we need, notes out students, causal data. Causal data is gold. That's one of the reasons why randomized controlled trials are are an important and valuable source of information, because they give you two worlds: a world where you did something and a world where you didn't do it, and they give you the difference, and that's causal information. It says, if our assumptions are correct, we do this, this will happen. And it's remarkable how much information organizations have that reassures them about how evidence-based they are, but isn't like that. It's not causal data, and therefore they can't possibly aspire to having evidence-based learning in their organizations.
So this kind of evidence-based learning that you've just talked about, especially we've talked a bit about randomized controlled trials in the course. The kind of evidence-based learning, just to sort of tie it in a little bit to when we talk a bit more about the Evaluator General, this kind of evidence-based learning does occur in the private sector, doesn't it? The sort of there are certain companies that need to run not randomized controlled trials necessarily, but run little experiments.
Yeah, well, they run randomized controlled trials, and they last a few hours, and they call it A/B testing.
A/B testing,
and that's something which turned up in newspapers, where they were testing what headlines worked at the turn of the 20th century. And that is causal data. And you don't need a university degree to do it. You need a bit of curiosity and systems which enable you to vary things and look at the results. So that is an example of evidence-based practice. Of course, you can do that badly. But that's getting at the heart of curiosity, of experimentation, of measurement, and then the systematization of knowledge that we have acquired that we are going to say is good enough to start systematizing into the culture and into the systems, and then we'll go looking around for the next improvements. That's sort of what happens in Toyota.
All right, and so that brings us quite nicely to then the idea of the Evaluator General. So in terms of, or do you want to sort of start by, so we've kind of identified some of the problems that exist in evidence-based policy making, and in terms of the issues of accountability and evaluation in government. Do you want to sort of talk us through the basic idea? I say basic, it's quite a complicated idea, but
sure.
Sort of.
Well, before I do that, let me just say that the one other building block for this, if you like, because I think you should be skeptical if someone says that they've seen this example of how you make cars and therefore that's how we should deliver social policy.
Sure.
So the other really big thing that happened to me was that in it shows how old I am, starting dates like that, that in 2009, at the end of 2009, I was asked to chair a thing called the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. Actually, it might have been 2010. Anyway, one or the other. I was, and so that's based in Adelaide, and it was picking up something which was fairly new at the time, certainly in its use for social programs, of human-centered design. And in fact, one of the things that Silicon Valley learned, you can think of Stephen Jobs' attraction to the GUI, to the graphical user interface. This idea of user friendliness was they realized commercially, it just jumped out at you that this was tremendously important to people. And so they got very good at that. And to get good at user-centered design, well, again, you have to, just like I'm talking about applying a somewhat subversive frame to what you know, one of the things about user-friendly design is you don't get it from the engineers who are telling you the design of these things because they're thinking about the engineering. You get it from people who problematize delivering services for people. So they go out, so Intel has a chief anthropologist, and that chief anthropologist used to be Genevieve Bell, and she's now at the ANU, South Australian woman. And those people realize that to understand what's happening from the user's point of view takes special effort, because the system will take its own point of view, not the user's point of view. So this so the exposure to this, and then watching a program be built, extremely radical program, extremely powerful program be built, gave me new hope that social programs, even for ingrained disadvantage, really can work. How much they can work, I don't know, but I used to think, well, we should try these programs, but we certainly shouldn't expect much success. I now think we can get quite a bit more success. So just to give you a quick idea of what this is, so we were looking at child protection, which is a very vexed area. So these are kids taken off their parents because their parents abuse or neglect them. And already those kids are really, you know, on a highway to nowhere. And you take them out of their families, and then we are incapable of providing them with good care. So we built this program in which one family that was falling, which identified itself as, this is sort of the system speaking, but the family would in some way, it would call itself a seeking family, a family seeking help in the systems language, an at-risk family. And then we would try to find families in the local neighborhood who could mentor that family, but there was also a professional input because this relationship was coached. And so together, these the mentor family and the family seeking help would work on their issues, and it was incredibly powerful. And I call it expertise as midwife, not obstetrician. Again, it's isegoria. Again, it's trying to get the voice and the perspectives and the drives and the motives of the people involved, not having people at the top carrying on and saying, we're the experts, we know what to do. And so we built this program, and then over the course of some time, I gradually realized that we keep building programs like this in Australia and everywhere else, and they never scale. They don't scale, they just sit there for a while, and then and then a new fad comes along. There's a long talk I could give you about what it would mean to scale. And it's just, again, thinking about it it's not just a matter, it's not like a market, and it's not, you don't just invest more in it. There's a whole lot to it. I won't go there, but the failure to live up to our rhetoric about how we're going to outsource services, and then we're going to encourage the best and either improve or discourage the worst. That is simply not what we do. And I've given you some sort of ideas of why that is. But so the problem for me was to try to build a system which retained this isegoria, that retained this effort and successful effort to see the world from the point of view of the people who you are seeking to serve. And then I realized, in the way that I'm arguing Toyota realized, even if that's a retrospective description, that getting that knowledge up to the top is hard work, because lots of things happen on the way up. They don't have to be conspiracies. They might be that a minister, that some program in another country or another jurisdiction means that the minister used to talk about mentorship as a great idea, but the minister's gone cold on mentorship, and now we're talking about whole communities or place-based learning or some other bullshit. Excuse me. And so you need a mechanism for nurturing knowledge at the coalface or in the field, for nurturing it, but not sentimentalizing it, because a lot of practice in the field isn't particularly good. And we always fool ourselves. We always think, certainly a lot of people in that part of the economy are they think they're pretty good people. And we end up in a thing which the development economist William Easterly called the cartel of good intentions. Because people's good intentions are so valorized, because people are raising money either through the political system or through donations, nobody is going to speak truth to this system and say, actually, this program isn't working very well, but here's some things that are working well. just one, I'm sort of trying to keep an eye on the time, but just one anecdote, which is quite shocking, I think. But I think it will, anyone with experience of government or even an organization will, you know, they won't find it that surprising. Hopefully they'll find it shocking, but they won't find it that surprising. So in one of the jurisdictions that Taxi studied, there was a child protection agency had gone through a process where the senior management decided to try to reunify children with parents that they had been taken off. Now, not automatically. So that meant they sort of looked at this and thought, well, gee, we're doing such a bad job when we take kids out of their families. Let's put more effort into putting some of them back in. And so that involves coming up with a system of identifying the best prospects, coaching them, supporting them, measuring the outcomes and so on. Well, the result was disastrous, or no, the result was bad from an organizational point of view. I'm pretty confident in saying it was catastrophic for the poor children who were put through it. There was a 30% success rate. In one suburb, an office took this challenge and learned who the best prospects were and learned how to support them. And they got that success rate to 85%. But over the 5 years of the program, of course, it gradually was discredited in the eyes of the community. And so the program was disbanded. The program ceased within the department. And the most shocking thing was this piece of gold that it had produced, this learning about how to do this thing. And it might turn out, you know, if you got an 85% success rate, this program is looking like a damn good thing, probably like a damn good thing to do. And what happened was that group of people was simply, nobody knew that they'd done this. They were scattered to the winds. They were, you know, and life went on as normal. So a system completely immune from learning, even though the people running it, I know some of these people, they're good people, but somehow this system couldn't do that. So the Evaluator General tries to build a system which nurtures, validates, and defends knowledge from the field, helps it be systematized, helps it be shared, and then manages it separately, and then and through that mechanism tries for this knowledge to be what drives the system, not who's most senior, not the latest fad. There's a bit of room for that, and there's nothing wrong with the odd fad. The new ideas come from the top as well as from the bottom, but a system with real integrity. And so that's the idea. So I can now sort of say a bit about how that might work.
Brilliant.
So think of the name, Evaluator General. The first thing that tells you is that I want it to be as independent as the Auditor General. So it's not bossed around by politicians. The Auditor General goes anywhere he or she wants and investigates that things are happening the way they should be happening. They report to Parliament, not to a minister, and they sort of can't be stopped doing what they're doing. So they're independent. But, and this is, everyone thinks, oh, I get that. He just wants a czar at the top. But that's not the point of the Evaluator General at all. The point of the Evaluator General is to have, and again, get those notes out, is to have structural separation between knowing and doing. So knowledge about evaluation is there's a lot to know. It's like being a scientist. So sort of, you can learn a lot of it at university, but you also need to learn a lot of it in the field. And a lot of people who are delivering your average program, Meals on Wheels or something like that, they're not particularly expert in that. And remember, they're liable to overestimate how much good they are doing. So the idea of the Evaluator General is to build, using the independence of an agency like the Auditor General, a bottom-up system, which is not like the Auditor General, a bottom-up system which, like the Toyota example, supports people in the field knowing what they're doing and encourages them to do it better, assuming that most people want to do it better because they do. They even want to make cars more productively. When they're out looking after little kids, they really want to do that better. What they want to feel good about, they want to turn up every day to do a good day's work, not a bad day's work. And so the Evaluator General embodies this idea of structural separation between knowing and doing. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that the monitoring and evaluation system, and every program will have one. A job active deliverer will know how many, what happened on Monday, how many new cases were taken on, who got jobs, and so on. The monitoring and evaluation, so the Evaluator General affects a structural separation between knowing and doing. Now, what I should have said before I've gone into this is I'll just double back and say, think about the Auditor General, an independent agency. So at the agency level in government, there's this really important distinction, which doesn't get taught much in public policy courses, which is that we have structural separation between knowing and doing when it comes to the statistics on unemployment and inflation. So we want the Treasury and the Finance Department and their ministers to deliver the lowest level of unemployment and that they can, subject to an acceptable inflation level. They don't measure the unemployment level or the inflation level. An independent agency, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, God bless its heart, does, for reasons you'll understand, does that work. So that is structural separation between knowing and doing. And the Evaluator General is there to try to deliver that down to the ground, so that at every place where a program works, it's not that you have, necessarily even different people with different uniforms on at every site. It is that you have two systems, a doing system and a knowing system, and they have somewhat different functions and expertise, but critically, they have different reporting requirements. So the monitoring and evaluation is ultimate, although you want very close collaboration between these two agencies, the monitoring and evaluation system and its outputs are independent of ministerial direction. But they are built from the perspective of the people on the line, the people with the knowledge about what's working. It's helping them make their work better. So that's essentially the Evaluator General, structural separation down to the workplace, arising up through accountability mechanisms, reporting mechanisms, and with the doing part, then the Department of Social Security will release a report on how much good it's done. And there is another agency called the Evaluator General that will be in charge of the monitoring evaluation system and of making that transparent to the community. So that's basically the idea, but you might want to sort of ask a few questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that gives students a good idea of what the Evaluator General would be sort of trying to achieve. Do you want to make a comment about what the sort of implementation of the Evaluator General might look like?
So firstly, I think it's all, again, since I've been speaking of gravitational forces, senior managers, when they pick up the Evaluator General, will almost certainly want the Evaluator General to unify monitoring evaluation systems. I regard that as a very second order priority to getting evaluation systems that are suited to the workplaces to help people do a better job. The next, another question is, well, okay, this is some kind of my own fevered brain, and I'm now saying I now want to reconstruct the whole of government. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build a skeleton, a scaffolding around which the right kind of learning can happen. So while I describe this thing as the Evaluator General, and its full implementation would be an officer and quite a well-resourced agency called the Evaluator General, you can pick up these ideas in a single agency, in a single unit, by simply trying to proceed according to the principles of structural separation. And again, another little slogan of mine is to try to build, to do what Toyota did, which is to build accountability to the top and transparency to the community on the self-transparency of the people on the line, in the field, trying to do the best job they can. And if you don't build on the self-transparency of people, which of course itself requires some independence from the people, because they're naturally inclined to give themselves the benefit of the doubt. If you don't build a system of accountability and transparency on self-accountability and self-transparency as it moves up the line, and people know they're going to be promoted or sacked based on what the information looks like, I think you know what's going to happen to the information.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, fantastic. I mean, I think that, so that I think has given us a really good insight into kind of what the problem looks like and what the Evaluator General is sort of trying to do and what it might look like in terms of...
and how you could build it slowly without calling it the Evaluator General.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got, I think we've only got 4 minutes left.
Okay.
So are there any sort of final things that you wanted to discuss about the Evaluator General, or?
Well, no, I thought I might just say that having kind of got as far as I've got on this, and then having interested myself in the way in which democracy is degrading in front of our eyes, this word iseguirrea, it turns out in retrospect, has just been central to the way I think about things. And I think our politics is full of the same kind of problem, which of course then doesn't mean politics needs an Evaluator General. You've got the same kind of problem, and then you have to rethink how you might build institutions to resist it. But I mentioned that this word iseguirrea is from ancient Athens, and ancient Athens I think of as the only democracy that was ever a jealous democracy. And what I mean by that is that the ancient Athenian democracy understood itself as existing only so long as it could fight off the always threatening power of the noble families, who were much happier with an oligarchy. So what the Athenians did is that they built institutions which actively resisted oligarchy. Modern democracy started with oligarchy, which was the nice word for that, as Aristotle would tell you, is an aristocracy. And then they democratized this aristocratic system like a parliament. They democratized it by having elections. Now, the problem with elections is the problem of iseguirrea. Let me tell you why. Slightly over 50% of our population have university degrees and therefore speak like university graduates. Over 95% of our parliamentarians have degrees. That's a real problem for iseguirrea, because people without a university degree don't hear their own culture projected back on them. We actually have an institution which is the same institution that the Athenians used in their democracy, but we only use it in our legal system. It's called a jury. And we just sort of select people at random. We put them into a group and we say, if you can arrive at a strong consensus, at least 9 out of 12 people, that's going to be a really big thing for us. And that is going to reassure us that our verdict of guilty or not guilty embodies iseguirrea, embodies the wisdom of the community, embodies the wisdom of the educated and the uneducated, or the less well educated. And I think, and maybe we can talk about this at another time, but I think this idea is a way, if you've got, bureaucracies don't think like this, because bureaucracies think in terms of controlling things from the top. That's fair enough. But if you've got a problem like having an ethics committee, there are lots of problems which turn out to turn to custard when they're done bureaucratically. And these kinds of things would be much better handled by citizen jury type mechanisms. So that's a bit of a teaser if you want to follow that up.
Absolutely.
In a later talk.
Well, and so it's good that you've mentioned that. So we've actually looked at citizen juries in the course. So we're betraying where a lot of my influences come from now. No, I think so. That actually pretty much puts us to the end of the lecture today. So I'd just like to wrap up and say thank you very much for giving your time to talk to us today.
Thanks. It's been fun. It's always, I have a weakness for hearing the sound of my own voice. No problem for me.
Fantastic.
I once said to a group, I suddenly thought, God, this is an hour-long talk. And I said to this group of school teachers, I said, my God, you've got an hour of me. I mean, it's easy for me. I find my voice fairly entertaining. What about you? So to your students, if apologies are due, my apologies are.
Not at all. All right. Thank you very much. And I will finish up there.
Thanks, Matthew.